would you say if you saw Rob Halford right now?
I'd jump his bones.
Alright kids, it's finally time again to talk about the Priest. No, not the one that touched your Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We don't want to go down that road again. I especially don't want to give you guys out there any triggers, except for maybe Scott Travis's drums. Or Dave Holland. But enough about pedophiles. I want to talk about something before we get into this retrospective here. I've already talked about Priest before. And I have a very strict rule trying to make these retrospectives where I will not try to redo a band that I've already done. Especially if you watch my reviews, it's fucking pointless. Maybe someday I'll redo all that stuff, but there's so many bands that I haven't gotten to, so it's like, why would I waste all that time? But I've been on such a massive Judas Priest kick, and they're such an awesome band, and I've had such a recent epiphany and such a change of heart with so many of their albums that I felt like I ought to go back and do justice to my metal gods. Judas Priest was my very, very first band discography that I reviewed, so not only are those early videos of mine, especially the Judas Priest ones, god-awful, and I please beg you not to go watch them for your sake. But not only were those videos bad, but the opinions were even fucking dumber. So like a middle-aged man that's being sexually depraved by his wife, I must get down on my knees again and beg and plead for Rob Halford to forgive me. He'll probably want me to give him the suck, but I'm kinda not into that. After all these years, when I finally figured out truly how amazing Judas Priest was and truly how consistent they were, I had a massive epiphany that Judas Priest are the best British heavy metal band ever. But Iron Maiden! But Judas Priest are much more consistent. They change it up a lot more. They're a lot more energetic. They're a lot more metal. They have an objectively better singer. Their set lists aren't complete dog shit. The new albums are actually good. And at least Tim Ripper Owens was a decent singer. Those albums may have been kind of subpar, but so were the Blaze Bayley albums. Big difference? Blaze Bayley's completely fucking tone deaf. So it's time that I announce that I am officially off the Iron Maiden train. And now it's time to unleash the other beast. The beast that wreaked havoc to the east. And the priest that touches you in the no-nos. But consensually. The birth of Judas Priest is metal's second stage of evolution for heavy metal itself. Obviously it formed with Black Sabbath. If you debate that, you're an absolute fucking retard. But Judas Priest are renowned for taking the blues and all the other weird shit and making it just metal. The band actually formed from the aftermath of another band in the late 60s that called themselves Judas Priest. And the only member of that band that would even go into the next lineup was the singer Al Adkins. But after that shit didn't work out, he formed a new band that was going to get rid of all that blues shit and go straight for hard rock. So he employed some members that would actually end up playing on Judas Priest albums. We have KKK Down Syndrome and Ian Hill. Now in these early stages of the band, Ian Hill and KKK and Al Adkins actually co-wrote a lot of the early songs together. Even songs that would end up on the second album would be co-written by Al Adkins. But then when they were having some financial difficulties, Al Adkins kicked himself to the curb, and with Al gone, they had no idea who to get on vocals. Until Ian Hill's girlfriend at the time recommended her brother. They went to her house to talk to the guy, and the guy was in the shower singing, and they said he had the voice of an angel. His name was Rob Halford. Rob Halford would shape the vocal style of metal completely. Before that, we had just some bluesy, hard rock style vocalists, but nobody that was a straight up screamer. But ever since Rob Halford, who is known as the metal god, and in my opinion the best metal vocalist of all time, that puts Bruce Dickinson to fucking shame, everybody everybody wants to sing like Rob Halford. So not only did Judas Priest with this move get a witch stubbing her toe on vocals, but they also got the very first drummer that nobody gives a shit about. Because Judas Priest blows through their drummers like kids blow their head off to Judas Priest. But before they even went in to record their first album, for some reason, their new recording company known as Gull Records demanded that the band get another member for some reason. However, this is probably the only good decision Gull Records ever made in the band's fucking career, considering they got one of the best guitarists in metal at the time, and easily the best writer in the entire band, and probably the most important part of the band's songwriting and hard metal sound, Glenn Tipton. So with the lineup finally completed, they went in to record an album that has one of the most retarded names in human history. An album that does not have any metal in it, but we're almost there. Rocka Rolla is easily the weirdest, most different, out there Judas Priest album of all time that does not fit with the crowd at all. However, I'll be one of the very few people that will defend this absurdly looking album. Because even though it's not metal, because Gull Records told them to get rid of all the fucking heavy songs that they were originally going to make their first album as, and say, hey, just release all your weird pop rock, psychedelic rock, progressive rock, and other weird shit as your first album. It's still some good songs on here. It's absolutely different, but if you're into hard rock like Led Zeppelin, early Deep Purple, and even progressive rock, this shouldn't be a hard listen at all. However, even though I do think this is a cool, enjoyable album that people should definitely give a chance, there are some absolute fucking dog shit moments on this album. Especially exemplified in the Winter Trilogy or Quadrilogy. I have no idea how Cheater is somehow supposed to be connected to the other three, but those Winter songs are so pointless and just plod on without any fucking cohesion whatsoever. Especially the third part that starts with a bunch of fucking noise that actually finally goes into something decent at the end. Another one of the weakest moments, and in my opinion, a big reason why people will refuse to listen to this album, acknowledge this album, or like this album, is because of the title track, Rocka Rolla, the song that everybody makes fun of, the song that everybody knows of as that video with Rob Halford in the fucking blouse, and KK Downing with the bizarre straw hat, where they all looked like a bunch of fags. But we gotta talk about some good stuff, or else you guys are gonna have this impression that this album is fucking awful. And easily the best song on this whole album is actually the first one. A song that's a great, slow-tempoed, blues, hard-rockin' song. One for the road. So Judas Priest ditched their drummer and get another nameless drummer that nobody gives a shit about. And just like the Birmingham band that inspired them at this time, this new Birmingham band, Judas Priest, decided to follow in their footsteps. The record company Gull Records was basically forcing them into submission to be as shitty as possible, releasing a subpar album when they had much heavier, much more metal, much better material that was already trying to follow in the footsteps of Black Sabbath. Not only was Gull Records repressing them creatively, but they were hardly paying them anything. They were basically starving and homeless. It's a miracle that Gull actually gave them one last chance for an album and actually let them release their heavier material. And boy, does it show that they were sitting on good stuff that Gull refused to release in the first album. Sad Wings of Destiny isn't only the sound of a young band trying to follow in the footsteps of Black Sabbath and be heavy and innovative, but they put a whole new definition to a band sounding young and hungry, because they're literally hungry. Albums like this are living proof that if you put a band in a corner to say, hey, either release the best album you can possibly do, or we're gonna fucking kill you, yeah, that band is gonna make one hell of an album. As great as it is, it's not without its faults. And one of the most noticeable problems with it is a weird fucking error on Gull Records' parts. To everyone that got the album when it first came out, they're probably thinking, what the fuck is this with the track listing? The second half of the album starts with an intro called Prelude. So what the hell is that? That's because the band intended for what became side 2 to be side 1. And then side 2, for some reason, ended up being side 1. It still works, especially considering now the album starts with an incredible song, Victim of Changes, that already has a great intro, but it just feels all wonky track listing wise, especially having intro in the middle of the album. I forgot to mention that Rob Halford is actually gay, which is all that anybody ever talks about Rob Halford for some fucking reason. Now, the only reason I even bring it up at this point, because this album is actually the beginning of the hilarious gay sexual innuendos, with the last song, originally intended to be the last song in the first side, Island of Domination.
Now we're taken unto the island of domination.
The highs throughout this album are so unbelievably fucking high. Tyrant, or as Rob says, Tyrant, is fantastic. Genocide is groovy as hell. Rob on his top form scream throughout the whole fucking thing. But speaking of screaming, the best song in the album is easily one of the craziest, most high screaming Judas Priest songs ever. A song that starts in the second line of the song with an insane scream. A song based on the British madman murderer, the Ripper.
I smile when I'm sneaking through shadows by the wall.
But to those that know Judas Priest sound after this point, we know that Judas Priest still is missing something. Something that would become a must on every single Judas Priest album. And that essential Judas Priest sound is finalized on the next album. Judas Priest's hard work actually paid off this time. Because they did such a great job on Sad Wings of Destiny, Columbia Records signed them on to produce Sin After Sin. And from there, they actually started to build their fan base pretty decently during the tour for Sin After Sin. Sin After Sin sees the band integrate that classic Judas Priest driving rhythm and riff style. On every single heavy song on this album, it feels like total classic Judas Priest. With the exception of the 2 ballads, this album is much heavier than Sad Wings of Destiny. And much more accessible too. Some people might find a lot of the songs on Sad Wings of Destiny to be kind of weird and still pseudo-prog. But on this album, those riffs are nothing but heavy metal, especially on stuff like Call for the Priest or fucking Starbreaker. But this riff style and that fucking insane driving rhythm is brought out the best on the pseudo-title track, intro to the album, Sinner. Speaking of rhythms, though, for once Judas Priest actually got a drummer that wasn't a nameless schmuck that nobody gives a fuck about. Well, nobody still gives a fuck about the guy, but I think that should change because this guy is probably the best drummer Judas Priest has ever had. Maybe not the best drum performance on the Judas Priest album because he sort of mailed it in, but Simon Phillips is a fantastic drummer, even though he is a session musician guy on this album. Look at his other shit. This guy is an insane technical jazz drummer. that should have stayed with Judas Priest after this point, to be honest. And Simon Phillips' double bass drum playing on this album was extremely innovative, especially for thrash metal. And another great thing that Judas Priest started to do on this album, that they would continue to do from this point on, is that they proved to be the absolute best cover band of all time. Every cover song that they've ever done has been absolute A+ material. They're the kind of group that takes a song and rewrites it to make it sound exactly like a Judas Priest song. As if this album wasn't already changing the waters enough, we get to the last song on this album, Dissident Aggressor, a song that's very renowned for being one of the very first thrash metal songs ever. On the tour for Sin After Sin, Judas Priest finally actually caught a whiff of some sort of fucking success that wasn't eating trash out of the dumpster. They opened for REO Speedwagon on a tour across the United States. And even though Sin After Sin was such a fucking massive step towards progression for this band and progression for heavy fucking metal, on their next album, Judas Priest get even more closer to that classic Priest sound and what metal would sound like from that point on. For the first time ever, Judas Priest has a drummer that is on more than one album and isn't just some nameless schmuck. We have a guy by the name of Les Bean. And this guy is a very good jazz drummer that does a fantastic job. This album is one of the most technical Judas Priest albums. This is the peak of their early 70s sound when they were trying to get more heavy, more technical, more progressive. But even though all those streamlined heavy metal albums would become very influential and important to the early heavy metal scene, this one is incredibly innovative. Nothing sounded this heavy at the time, and this is easily the very first front to back, out and out, balls to the wall, no colored people allowed heavy metal album ever made. And as if it couldn't get any better, this album being technical, heavier, and more badass. But Rob Halford is at his absolute peak on this album. This album contains all the best Rob Halford screams, especially on the insanely kick-ass, fast and furious first on the album, the classic Exciter. This album is absolutely everything it advertises, metal and class. Every single song has a great swagger to it as well. White Heat Red Hot has a fantastic pace to it. And Vader, an incredible driving rhythm to it. Saints in Hell, an incredibly badass and bluesy riff. Hero's End has one hell of a bizarre groove. I could just keep going on and on about the songs in this album. I'd say this is one of the only Judas Priest albums where every song is absolutely perfect. And although my personal favorites on the album is Stained Class, the title track, for its badass gallops throughout the whole thing, I gotta give credit where credit's due and talk about probably the most notable track on this album. The longest song, the song that was co-written by Les Bean, a song that contains the only Judas Priest drummer writing credit ever, making this the only Judas Priest album to have all members writing on it. We have the classic ballad that's a great song to killing yourself to, known as Beyond the Realms of Death. And speaking of killing yourself, in the late 80s, early 90s, Judas Priest got in a huge lawsuit over two kids that tried to kill themselves listening to Judas Priest. But if you watch the documentary that was done on the court case, you'll find some very interesting things. The parents are complete fucking cunts. But the parents tried to make some bizarre argument that Judas Priest convinced the kids to kill themselves through backmasking. Backmasking became a very popular thing in the 80s and even past that point, where people would reverse records and see if they can find hidden messages. And apparently in the cover song on this album, which is really funny that they tried to say that Judas Priest hid a message in a cover song, and a weird fucking recording error on the song from the Spooky Tooth cover known as Better By You, Better Than Me. They reversed it, and they keep claiming that in that chorus, if you play it backwards, he's saying do it, which makes no sense because the song's not about killing yourself, and it's not like they're saying kill yourself, do it.
Better by you, better than me. You can say what I can see.
But despite all that, even the cover song on this album is quite a mind-blowing song.
Delivering the goods. Delivering the goods.
For the last Judas Priest album of the 70s, Killing Machine / Hellbent for Leather has two titles for different places that it was released. It was originally released as Killing Machine, but then when they tried to release it in the US, people thought, oh, that's too violent. Even though their last album had an album cover of some metal guy getting a fucking sword or some shit through his head. But instead they went with a title that I think might also be better for different reasons, Hellbent for Leather. The title Hellbent for Leather is actually a lot more creative and pretty much exemplified the look of them at the time and the look of what would be metal bands throughout the 80s. Rob Halford wanted to express his homosexuality on stage without wearing some weird fucking dress and medieval garments, so we went into an S&M shop and got some leather studs and whips and all that good sexy shit. And the whole band decided to adopt that look because it looked pretty badass. And then from that point on, everybody knows that that's the look of metal, unless you're a weird fucking black metal autistic. But as mentioned before on this album, they transformed themselves visually and even sonically. Instead of trying to go for a very technical, very, very heavy metal approach, they kind of sold out in a way on this album. It's definitely more stripped down. Rob Halford's not screaming throughout the whole album. In fact, he's doing more of a gruff, mid-range vocal. And isn't it funnier when Rob Halford tries to sing a little bit lower? He somehow sounds gayer. And by the way, all joking aside, I have to remind you idiots that I'm obviously not anti-gay. I just feel that they shouldn't procreate is all. This more mainstream stripped-down approach definitely helps in many ways, especially on the catchier songs in this album, such as the title track, and one of the absolute Judas Priest classics, the first on the album, Delivering the Goods. But in other places, it definitely hinders them. For some reason, a lot of people like to ignore the existence of, by far, one of the worst Judas Priest songs ever fucking made. A song that is absolutely lifeless, boring, irritating as fuck, and beyond cheesy. Cheesy to the point where it's not even enjoyable and it's so bad it's good way. We're talking about Take on the World.
Put yourself in our hands so our voices can be heard. And together we will take on all the world.
Even though it's the least technical and probably least best heavy metal Judas Priest album of the 70s, it still stands as a stone cold classic, being extremely influential not only looks-wise, but sound-wise to the incoming 80s metal scene. And even after that point, people would still be ripping off riffs from this album. But as if Judas Priest wasn't already making massive statements of nuclear intent, in 1979 they smacked the world in the face with one of the greatest live albums ever fucking made, known as Unleashed in the East. And as if Judas Priest's resume wasn't already getting packed with insane, incredible commendations, they still one-upped themselves in commerciality. In 1980, the band releases an album that might be the most important album in their entire legacy. But there's just so fucking many of them anymore that who can tell what's their most important album. But the band tends to consider this one their most important breakthrough album, because this album made Judas Priest a household name and made them the leaders of the heavy metal scene at the beginning of 1980.
Wielding the axe comes the one culmination that's always seems certain to bring down the curtain and read. Sifting the good from the bad, it's the age for the rage of the dogs which must fall to the just and be free.
Before Judas Priest even came in 1980 and gave the loving touch of life to heavy metal, we had another member join the band as Lesbian decided to quit. We got a guy named Dave Holland, and his simplistic commercial drumming style would touch the band throughout their entire 80s output. And this lineup alone left the biggest touching impression throughout the 1980s of what metal at that time was supposed to be. I mean, just the way Davey Holland touched those skins, it was like euphoria. Judas Priest once again has a weird problem with the track listing on the US version of this album. Like the fucking dumbass Americans we are, we only listen to albums' first couple songs, hoping that they're the hits. So for some reason, the record company decided to jumble up the track listing to shove Breaking the Law and Metal Gods up towards the top of the album, which wrecks the entire flow and entire initial impact of this album from one of the fucking most awesomest songs ever made, Rapid Fire. As good as the classic Breaking the Law is, it's a fucking mar against humanity to actually bump Rapid Fire from the first song on the album. But even with such a heavy, badass opening of Rapid Fire, you should expect a lot more from this album because there's a lot of diversity throughout the whole album. Most of the whole middle of the album being very commercial, so really expect the fast, heavy metal songs to open and end the album, with of course Rapid Fire and the other very underrated, badass song known as Steelers.
Catch the plane now, eye to eye. Don't let chances pass you by.
But there's other great cuts of kick-assery like the very, very catchy The Rage and Grinder, which is pretty funny, pretty homoerotic, but on all the good ways. But everything else is pretty damn mainstream. Of course we know about Breaking the Law, Living After Midnight. But even some of the more underrated songs in here, You Don't Have to Be Old to Be Wise, is very neglectfully talked about, but it's still a very, very mainstream, easy to get into song. And same thing goes with what I think is probably the best mainstream song in this album that still has a great, slow metal vibe to it, Metal Gods.
Marching in the streets, dragging iron feet.
But as much as I fucking adore the shit out of this album nowadays, I have to admit that I used to kind of have a condescending view on this album. I've always liked the hits and all that shit, but I used to have a problem with Rapid Fire for some fucking bizarre reason that I cannot explain for the life of me. Throughout their career so far, Judas Priest were chugging the choo-choo train of cock up our assholes and we were loving it. However, in 1981 there was a slight setback to this ongoing, on-chugging legacy of Judas Priest. This album simply deserves another big chance from people, considering it has a lot of fan-fucking-tastic, classic, late 70s, early 80s classic rock Judas Priest songs to it. We have easily the best on the album that has a great driving rhythm to it, Desert Plains, and also my second favorite song on the album, the song to fucking open it, and one of their absolute classics that they've played on almost every tour since, Heading Out on the Highway. There's a bunch of filler on this album, dude. Although there are a few songs that do definitely suck ass in this album, You Say Yes probably being the biggest fucking turd, there are definitely a lot of other amazing songs in here. Solar Angels, very kick-ass and extremely poppy and catchy. Turning Circles, which has an incredibly catchy chorus. All the Way being kind of simplistic, but also having a nice chorus. And On the Run, the last song, is incredibly underrated and definitely deserves a lot more attention. And of course, we forgot to talk about the hilarious classic from the band, Hot Rockin', featuring the fucking funniest Judas Priest music video ever, with a bunch of greased up British guys working out in the gym, looking at each other's balls. But there are still some chinks in the armor that make this the weakest Judas Priest album at this point, other than, of course, Rocka Rolla. You Say Yes is terrible, and Don't Go, the second song, although it has a really great catchy chorus, the verse is absolutely downright fucking bizarre, especially those weird echoes that I cannot even explain. It sounds like modern remixes. But to all the bucket-headed retards that kept screaming, "Sellouts!" on point of entry, you are about to be proven the fuck wrong. Because on this next album, Judas Priest stomped on everyone's fucking face with an album that was heavier than everything they'd done to that point, and more commercial than anything that they've done to that point. They took the heavy sound of Stay in Class and mixed it with the great, catchy songwriting of stuff like British Steel.
My second's clean. I am perpetual. I keep the country clean. I'm elected electric spy. I'm protected electric eye. I'm elected electric spy. I'm elected protected detective electric eye.
Despite what a lot of idiot metalheads would tell you about this album, or British Steel, or Judas Priest in general, this album is fantastic, and it's not just one song. Obviously, it is not one song, even to some fucking absolute dumbasses. How can you even ignore something like Electric Eye and still say that, oh, this album is only You Have Another Thing Coming, otherwise it's a pile of shit? Well, your whole fucking existence is a pile of shit. The album starts with one of the greatest intros of all motherfucking time, the Hellion, that goes right into the classic Electric Eye, then curb stomps you with Riding on the Wind, the absolute greatest driving song ever fucking made. Then they hit you with one of the fucking heaviest, grooviest, catchiest songs ever written, known as Bloodstone. Then comes a poppy song, Take These Chains. Still very catchy, still very poppy, not very cheesy at all. Then they hit you with Pain and Pleasure, hilariously homoerotic, very groovy, easy to get into, absolutely metal. And as if it wasn't getting fantastic enough, they hit you with the best song on the whole album, one of the best Judas Priest songs ever, that features one of the best Judas Priest guitar duels, one of the best Rob Halford vocal performances ever, and one of the most oddly groovy speed metal songs ever written, the title track Screaming for Vengeance.
So you waited on it, find your time. Rip off that script again, gotta break the line. Everyone who makes it in the greatest game needs $1,000 in the way.
Fever, Devil's Child, the hits do not stop hitting on this album. But of course, those retards that should not be allowed to procreate are right about one thing. That there is one very important song in this album. And that is the song that will forever solidify Judas Priest as one of the most important bands of all time. In fact, for their commercial songs, this one's pretty heavy compared to those ones. In fact, really the only commercial thing about the song is the fact that it's kind of more mid-tempo. You've Got Another Thing Coming. With Scream for Vengeance, Judas Priest were advertising that they were getting back to a heavier sound, and it definitely worked for them. But were they going to go in a more commercial route like they've been trying to dip their feet in throughout the 80s? And the answer to that is absolutely fuck no! And instead of making an album filled with songs like You've Got Another Thing Coming, Judas Priest makes an album filled with songs like Screaming for Vengeance, Bloodstone, and Electric Eye. Just what the fans fucking wanted and deserved, making one of the best Judas Priest albums ever. The last 3 songs! You're talking about Night Comes Down, a great melodic ballad song that basically just sounds like Fever. And even though the rest of the album is pretty fast and pretty heavy, Heavy Duty, although slow, is still a fantastic metal song that's very catchy and very kick-ass. But there is one thing I'll agree with the retards again on, is that those are technically the weakest songs in the album. But we're talking about an album that is fucking quality through and through. This album is filled with heavy metal masterpieces, the slower songs being Some Heads Are Gonna Roll, which is an absolute fucking classic, Love Bites, and a very underrated song that was originally intended for Screaming for Vengeance, known as Rock Hard Ride Free. But the fucking speedy songs in this album are absolutely relentless. Freewheel Burning, a song that's equipped with the fucking craziest vocal deliveries from Rob Halford ever recorded. And then follow that up with the homoerotic song Jawbreaker. But the best song is by far the 4th song in this album. Maybe my favorite Judas Priest song ever made, that not only has great riffs, incredible performances, but the atmosphere is at its absolute best on The Sentinel. But Jawbreaker is not the only obviously homoerotic song on this album. There's one song that is probably the most obvious sexual innuendo on any Judas Priest title ever, to the point that it even got them in serious trouble with the PMRC, which was running rampant in the 1980s. You know, the people that started the whole parental advisory sticker bullshit. They had a list of 15 songs that they felt were very objectionable and very bad for kids to hear. And number 3 on the list was the insane speed metal song on this album that literally has a lyric that I'll make you do it at gunpoint, Eat Me Alive. At the time, Judas Priest appeared to be becoming faster, more precise, more energetic. However, even though the band's material at this time was so strong, the band was starting to have problems internally, specifically with Rob Halford. Rob Halford used to be a really bad drug addict and alcoholic, and it was actually starting to even affect some of his vocals, especially if you compare some of the tours he did right after he became sober to what he was doing before that, even on the Defenders of the Faith Scream for Vengeance tours. His throat sounded like it was clogged up and shit until he got off the drugs. But before he even became sober, the guy tried to kill himself because something about like his secret boyfriend killed himself, and he got fucking super sad about it. He like downed some pills and shit, and it didn't work. So thank God Rob's still alive, and he was able to get off of his addictions, and because of that, he was better than ever, but only for a short while. But even though Rob persevered, the funniest thing is that they were actually working on an album that you think, with all these circumstances, would actually turn out to be a great album to most people. However, the album that they were working on was originally intended to be a double album. One half of the album would be commercial 80s style glam rock type shit, and the other half of the album would be a much more heavy Judas Priest album, like a Defenders of the Faith, which is a cool idea to do because it's like pushing the new boundaries, doing the whole commercial shit that they like to do and that they benefit from, but also appeasing the fans with the really heavy, exciting stuff. But the record company said nope to that shit, and they basically had to release it in 2 consecutive albums, adding more songs onto the second half. Those 2 albums became 2 of the most polarizing albums. The second one being released as the heavier album, Ram It Down, which we'll get into in a bit, and the first half of the album turning into an extremely polarizing, very hated commercial album known as Turbo. The truly sad thing about Turbo is that it tried to basically be a sellout album, even though originally it wasn't intended to be a full-on sellout because it was trying to mix heavy with commercial to appeal to different types of audiences, which is actually a good idea, and I commend them for trying to do that. But with just Turbo alone, and not even like a build-up to this album, just a straight-up commercialized, synth-oriented album coming right off of the heels of a fucking furiously fast album, this was an insult to the fans. But the really sad thing is that it didn't even appeal to the audience it was trying to appeal to. They were trying to get the whole Bon Jovi fucking hair metal audience. They advertised the hell out of the album. They even did commercials for it. They had music videos, everything. They did everything they could to promote this album, and it still really didn't do anything for them. In fact, it was a massive flop commercially.
Do you know me, lead singer of Judas Priest, idol of millions? Wherever I go, in case folks don't know me, I always make sure I carry my turbo.
Judas Priest's new album, Turbo. Don't wreck home without it.
The song Turbo Lover, the first song, of course, became a hit, but other than that, the album was widely ignored. Probably the dumbest mistake they made making this, other than the music alone, which a lot of people would argue is so fucking stupid, it's so commercial, but there was a dumber decision than even that. The band was asked to put songs from this album onto the soundtrack for the movie Top Gun, and we all know how big of a hit that movie became, and we all know how big that movie made the song Into the Danger Zone. But what if Judas Priest had got their head out of their asses and their management had let them put songs from this album in the movie soundtrack? Do you have any idea how popular this album would have been? In fact, because that movie was such a hit, this album would have stayed popular for years. For years! But you know what, at the end of the day, I think this album gets way too much bad attention. In fact, I think it probably should have gotten the commercial attention it deserved at the time, because at least, you know, it would have helped the band and not put them in a fucking rut for the next few years. They should have actually, you know, at least got a little bit of that crowd, but it didn't work that way for some reason. But you know what? This album isn't as far of a cry as people claim it is. In fact, the only really big, notable thing that I find really irritating about this album is some of the annoying repetitive choruses, but the way Rob sings on it, even though his voice is objectively better and it's like completely healed from the drug abuse, something's very weird about the way he sings on this album and even Ram It Down, which is really funny because a lot of these songs are trying to appeal to the whole 80s hair metal scene, so they're singing about like hot chicks and stuff, but Rob's gay as fuck. But at the end of the day, this album is basically just stuff like British Steel, Point of Entry, and all the commercial Judas Priest stuff, which synthesizers are not that fucking bad, and they're not that annoying on this album. Turbo Lover, of course, Locked In is great. Private Property is pretty good, but goddamn, the worst song in this fucking album is easily the cheesiest song. A song that does have good subject matter, how they're basically taking a shit on the PMRC, but the song is a piece of shit itself, so it's like comparing turds. Every other song I really like on this album. They have like an epic power ballad type of song called Out in the Cold. That's really cool. Most people will agree that that's a pretty damn good song. Wild Nights, Hot and Crazy Days is the epitome of what I'm trying to say about this album. It's just Judas Priest. It's typical Judas Priest. Listen to this fucking song and tell me that it would not fit on British Steel. It would not fit on fucking Screaming for Vengeance. Obviously, it would not fit on Defenders of the Faith, because that album was super fucking heavy. But, I mean, come on, just compare it to that commercial Judas Priest shit, and it's the same goddamn thing. In fact, I like this album a lot. Of course, it has a shitty song in there, but I mean, just about every Judas Priest album has a shitty song in there. It definitely deserves another chance for most people, especially considering a lot of you guys are worshiping a band that was commercial sellouts to begin with. And then you're going to say that this album's a sellout album? They sold out years ago. That's the point of Judas Priest, you fucking retards. Ram It Down. The entire reason I probably made this video. An album that I absolutely shat on when I first reviewed it. And once again, please don't go back and watch those videos, they're terrible. But this one was the very first album I ever shat on, and it still holds a special place in my heart. However, since that time, I've actually grown one hell of an appreciation for this album. I really like it nowadays. Before we even talk about why I like it now, I have to talk about why I didn't like it then, and it's still criticisms that I still hold for this album. A big problem I had with it is it tries the sort of Return to the Defenders of the Faith heavy feel, but it kind of doesn't fully get there. There's a few songs that are heavy and fast, of course the title track being one of them, and easily the best on the fucking album. Then right away it goes to some weird slow tempo stuff, and it mostly remains there for the rest of the album. Hard as Iron's fast, and then we kind of have some like mid-paced rockers that are really catchy, like Come and Get It and I'm a Rocker. But other than that, the album remains in kind of a slow pace. Also, a lot of these songs kind of have a bit of a filler vibe, even though I do like some of the fillers, like Love You to Death and Monsters of Rock. It reminds me of those filler songs in like Point of Entry. But one of my biggest fucking gripes with this album, and I still absolutely hate this, is the fact that some of the songs in here use a drum machine, and it's still not disclosed which ones do, but they try to hide it with the fact that the drums, like the normal drums that Dave Holland uses on this album, are produced so fucking weirdly that the whole album sounds like a drum machine. So who even knows? It just all sounds terrible drum-wise. And one of the worst sounding moments on this album, even though I like the song a lot, is Heavy Metal. That fucking drum sound is so bad. And then Love Zone has terrible drum sounds as well, but then again, that whole song is god-awful. Easily the worst thing on the album. And easily the worst moment of the drums on this album, and it's probably a drum machine considering how synthetic and awful it sounds on the song, is on a fantastic song that does not deserve such horrible sounding drums. The Epic's on the album, so that's very dark. That, you know, other than Ram It Down, is probably the best on the album, and a massive kick-ass standout. We're talking about the epic Blood Red Skies. But the drums are so fucking loud and synthetic and compressed on this song that you can actually hear fucking distorted screeches, which is not good. Just something about this album really annoyed me in those days. It was kind of the drum machine, kind of the weird writing style, the fact that it wasn't a full-on Defenders of the Faith and Painkiller, and that it kind of seemed a little sleazy, but you know what? I've grown to really like it, and a lot of these songs I do really like. Even the fillers, even the cover song I do quite like. There's honestly only one song I think is really shitty. I think a lot of other people need to give this one a chance, but I think if it didn't have a shitty drum machine, and if they had worked on some of the songs a little bit more. In fact, there's even a B-side from this album that was better than some of the songs in here. Maybe if they had a song like that and a couple others, this album would have been really good and people would have loved it, but it didn't do anything for them. They decided to kick out Dave Holland and the drum machine, and actually hire a real drummer. And speaking of that, there's actually some weird rumors that during like the Ram It Down tour that they didn't even have Dave Holland play drums, that they had an actual drummer under his riser, which is fucking absolutely retarded. Do you honestly think that if you put a drummer in a box that they're gonna have any sort of fucking sound that doesn't sound muffled and shitty? And Judas Priest decided to actually finally put out something substantial to heavy metal itself. They got a speed metal drummer for the band Racer X known as Scott Travis, a guy that I think gets worshipped way too much. The guy used to be able to play like double bass drums and shit fast, which was cool for the time, but honestly, he's not that technical of a drummer. Simon Phillips, even Les Binks, or whatever the fuck that guy's name is, were better drummers. Now, Judas Priest also made another great decision by getting the guy that produced Sad Wings of Destiny, a guy by the name of Chris Sangares. And the mission statement of this album: to crush all other bands that have tried to pass them. They really outdid themselves in every way, to the point where Rob Halford is basically screaming on every fucking song and doing some of his best vocals ever fucking recorded. But they outdid themselves so badly that even on the tour, the band seemed kind of sluggish compared to what they recorded, and Rob's voice was fucked. This began the horrible trend of Rob Halford singing to his feet instead of to his fans. But it wasn't even just this album. He was overdoing it way too much. Even on the Ram It Down tour, he literally screamed through every song. His vocals definitely came back better than ever after he sobered up, but after you scream every single song in your set, night after night, you're gonna blow out your voice permanently. But what a hell of an album to have his final amazing vocal performance, and that weird charisma to his voice in the past two albums is completely absent here. Every single song in here is an absolute classic and absolutely just as good as every other song on here. Most people would agree that the filler on this album that nobody really talks about as much is a song called Between the Hammer and the Anvil, and it's still a 10 out of 10 song.
Stop warning, but there's no fear. Lies forming, the sacrament lays bare.
Now, the song Painkiller gets a lot of attention, and it's usually heralded as the best song from the band. But there's a lot of songs in here that a lot of people tend to ignore for some reason. But there's one song that kind of slows things down, and I don't mean in like it's a ballad type of way, but a lot of people consider it the ballad on the album because it's the only song that's slow, but honestly there's no balladry elements to the whole thing at all. There's only maybe a keyboard to it, and it's a little slow, but it's still heavy as fuck. Hell Patrol is a galloping exercise of shock and awe, all guns blazing. Holy shit. Leather Rebel, another relentless song that's really fast, really killer. Metal Meltdown perfectly describes what this song is. It starts with some crazy guitar solo shit, and it does not let up until the very end of the song. Nightcrawler, a very dark, atmospheric song that's a little bit more stripped down, a little bit more easy to get into, not as crazy, but it's still just as good. Now, one last song I do want to talk about. A song that gets not nearly enough attention as it deserves. The band has played every song off this album, except for this one song, and it is a travesty. They have never played this fucking song. But it's probably my favorite Judas Priest song ever. It's the last song on the album. You guys need to give this one a lot more love and attention, and Judas Priest needs to fucking play this song live we're talking about the song that has not only fantastic riffs, fantastic vocals, a fantastic chorus, and an incredible lead guitar section of guitar solos dueling each other insanely fast, and some of the craziest screams from Rob Halford. A song that has the glory of ending probably the best heavy metal album ever made. One shot at glory. Now, before we move on to the dark period of the band, I want to make a note that for some reason, a lot of big Judas Priest fans, not like the casual heavy metal fans, are like, yeah, I like some Judas Priest albums, like the 70s stuff and all that shit. For some reason, all the hardcore fans, especially the ones that were there from the beginning, really don't like Painkiller that much. In fact, there's actually a lot of people that hate this album and say it's really cheesy and shitty. I cannot figure out for the life of me why. But a lot of the newer Judas Priest fans that kind of got into them through like Screaming for Vengeance, Defenders of the Faith, that like the whole metal Priest, will hold this one up as like the best. But for some reason, there's even people that think like Hellbent for Leather and shit's better than this. Like, really, dude? Really? I have a hard time comprehending that people even think anything is better than this album. Maybe the 70s albums, maybe Defenders of the Faith and Screaming for Vengeance, but really? Really, you actually think British Steel and Hellbent for Leather are better than this album? Give me a fucking break. This album is incredible front to back, and you are a fucking fake fan if you keep saying this is one of their worst albums. So after the painful Painkiller tour, Rob Halford decided to leave Judas Priest. Instead, he started solo projects like Fight, 2, and Halford. Instead of singing to a big-ass audience like he did before, instead from this point on, he would sing to an audience of his feet because, you know, Rob Halford's a faggot! So the band thought they were done. What were they going to do without their classic singer? They auditioned a man from a cover band of theirs that could pull off the high screams flawlessly. So Iron Maiden auditioned and accepted oh shit, wrong band. So Judas Priest auditioned and accepted a man by the name of Tim Owens, or as they called him, Tim Ripper Owens, because his audition was literally the first couple lines of the song The Ripper, and he fucking nailed it. Even though I do like Tim Ripper, and I feel like he gets the short stick all the time, but he's also in Judas Priest, so he kind of gets the short dick as well. But people shit on him for this whole dark era of the band, even though he didn't really write anything, which is probably the biggest problem of these two Tim Ripper albums, is that Glenn Tipton pretty much wrote and controlled everything. And even though the music is good, the lyrics are fucking awful. If I hear Desecrate one more goddamn time, but that's enough of that shit. However, there is one criticism I do have for Ripper, the man, is that for some reason, even though he could sing and do the screams perfectly compared to Rob Halford, for some reason the band decided to downtune on this era, which kind of made Tim sound all weird, and from this point on, he would get a lot of backlash for singing whiny. And we know this guy can pull this shit off. He could still pull these crazy high screeching vocals off. In fact, there's many points on these albums where he even kind of sounds like a weird grunge vocalist because his vocals are kind of suited for a different tuning. The same thing for Blaze Bayley, where he actually needed to go down and they stayed in E, and his voice sounded like shit because of it. But now the moment we've all been waiting for, the album that every fan that has been watching this has been awaiting for me to talk about. It's time to get jugulated. Whatever the fuck that means. Now, I have to admit something at this point. Another big reason why I decided to do this retrospective is because I've been listening to a lot of their albums lately. I realized I kind of like all their albums. Even these Tim Ripper albums, which are in many ways subpar. However, I do think Jugulator is a pretty damn good album. It's almost like a follow-up to Painkiller, where there's a lot of screams, there's a lot of great heavy thrashy riffs. However, the biggest problem musically is that instead of going really fast, technical, and melodic, it kind of goes darker, heavier, slower, but the production and the riffs are all still pretty damn good. Another problem is the fucking intros at the front of every single song on this album are really pointless and makes the songs drag on. And like I stated before, the lyrics are fucking awful. Glenn, can you please write a lyric that isn't desecrate 1,000 lines for fuck's sake?
They rob your soul and then desecrate you.
But there's amazing highlights throughout this album. Jugulator is a pretty damn cool, thrashy song. Bloodstained has a great groove to it. Dead Meat's pretty damn good. Death Row's fucking amazing. There are some weak points on here though. Decapitate kinda sucks. Abductors is fucking dog shit. I mean, it's really hard to take this album seriously when the song Decapitate has a lyric that says, "Your head, you must lose it." Come on. A very interesting song on this album, however, is one of the better songs that's pretty long, however, has a lot of great riffs to it that has a lot of dark atmospherics, and the fucking vocals are on top form on this song. However, the problem with it is that it's literally South of Heaven by Slayer. The last song, Cathedral Spires, is one of the best Priest songs ever. It's extremely long, extremely well written, just fucking incredible, especially the ending when Tim Ripper screams his ass off. Most people would probably agree that this album is weaker than Jugulator, and probably the weakest album the band has ever released. Demolition's main problem is that it's not focused at all. There'll be several great songs with great riffs, and maybe a little experimental even, like Machine Man, One on One, Jekyll and Hyde, Devil Digger, great riffs all over, heavier songs, but then it gets weak when they do weird fucking ballads like Close to You, In Between, and shit like that. But I think two of the best songs in this album are actually kind of towards the end. You have Metal Messiah, which ends the album with some really, really creative different directions that they take, and some really great riffs. But then my favorites on the album is one that's not talked about very much. It's kind of different, it's kind of weird, but that chorus, even though it's so fucking 90s, I think it's extremely catchy. Subterfuge. In sublimation, Demolition is weak, but not bad. I'd say it's pretty okay to mediocre. I think it gets shat on a little too much because there are good songs on it. There was something that this album was lacking a lot. Not just the writing, which they would at least make a little bit better on the next album, but the vocals, even though I like Tim, were still a little lacking. So in the early 2000s, Judas Priest met up with Rob Halford to discuss some fucking best of compilation, and they decided to reunite from that point on. However, the problem is that Rob Halford had pretty much already fucking destroyed his voice. He definitely sounds better than Bruce Dickinson in the 2000s, but I'd argue that maybe even Tim was a better fit for Judas Priest at this point. And speaking of Iron Maiden, I just want to put this somewhere in the video, so I might as well put it here. A lot of people debate why Judas Priest and Iron Maiden, like why Iron Maiden is more popular than Judas Priest, or that maybe Judas Priest would have been more popular if Eddie was in the band. I think Judas Priest took a big hit to their popularity, not in the 80s, because they were pretty much always ahead of Iron Maiden during that time. They took a massive hit in the 90s and the 2000s. The reason for that is if you space out your albums too long, and especially if you let them down, then they're not gonna fucking come back to you. Well, of course, Iron Maiden also had problems in their 90s era, and Judas Priest was kind of in the same rut but they waited way too long to reunite with their vocalist. Iron Maiden did it in 2000. Judas Priest did it a couple years later. And when Iron Maiden reunited, they released songs that were pretty commercial, easy to get into, and they released several critically acclaimed albums over and over and over. But Judas Priest in the 2000s got into a rut where they spaced out albums too far, and either made albums that were disappointing or way too experimental, and only recently have gotten back to being able to make hit songs. So in my opinion, Judas Priest are not as popular as Iron Maiden nowadays because Judas Priest has a very bad problem with making new fans, or even bringing back fans for the 2000s albums. And that brings us into the Return album, an album that's, even though good, pretty disappointing. Now, even though the songs in this album are pretty decent, it's very, very disappointing because what we expect is some sort of amazing, heavy Painkiller album, or at least something along the lines of like Defenders of the Fates or Screaming for Vengeance, something fucking heavy. But the album kind of feels all over the place. On one hand, we kind of have a continuation of Painkiller, but not as good, with songs like Demonizer, Hellrider, and then some classic heavy Judas Priest with songs like Deal with the Devil, which they should have made a single because that's total classic, catchy Judas Priest. But of course, they're too fucking stupid to do that.
Deal with the devil, 'cause you know that it's real. Gonna deal with the devil, for my heart made of steel.
But then we got weird shit throughout the whole album. The first song is absolutely fucking bizarre. It tries to be heavy or something, but it just feels all wonky and awkward. If you look at the term mailed in on Google, Judas Rising is the first thing that comes up. And then we have weird experimental dog shit like Revolution that tries to be all bluesy and worth fighting for, that comes off as like a weird poppy ballad. And then we have two other ballads, Angel and Eulogy. It just seems like a waste on this album. It seems like it was very slapped together. But then it gets even weirder on my favorite song on the album, believe it or not. I mean, it kind of switches between this and Hellrider. But the last song on this album is a song I used to absolutely fucking hate, making this one of my least favorite, if not my least favorite Judas Priest album ever. Until recently, I realized why the song is actually good and underrated. Now, it is too long, standing at 13 minutes, and it doesn't have that many time changes or different riffs to it, and it's kind of repetitive. But Loch Ness is excellent and long because it's a very slow-paced, doomy song. And Judas Priest has never really done doom before. I think they excel at it on this song. So Angel of Retribution is considered a mixed bag. So should the band pursue more of the sound that the fans want, like they did on the songs Demonizer and Hellrider? Fuck no, let's release a double symphonic power metal concept album and see how the fans like that.
And now this possession becomes my one obsession. A drifting illusion, a confusion.
Even though I think this album is a very stupid move for the band, I do really like this album because I think it's very different, it's very outside of the box, and it's even very heavy and creative in the spots where I think it needed to be. Angel of Retribution tried to kind of mix it up a little bit while also sort of incorporating some of their older elements, but I think Nostradamus does that even better. Even though you have cheesy power metal songs all over the place that instead of saying Desecrator over and over and over again, we say Nostradamus over and over and over again. But there are a lot of great heavy moments all over it that actually harken back to classic Judas Priest or even cool new directions for them. The songs Persecution and Nostradamus remind me of Painkiller. But there's a lot of unique creative decisions they made on this album. They made a lot of cool power metal songs like Pestilence and Plague, and and the song Conquest. The song War sounds very experimental, very different, very, very wrong and a weird choice for a single though. Prophecy and Revelations is great as well. Lost Love, the ballad, is dog shit. But there's like two kind of softer songs that I really like on the second side of this album, which is easily the weaker of the two sides though. We have the great song Exiled and the incredibly catchy, lengthy song Alone.
We don't wanna be alone. We said all along, we just wanna be.
However, there's some faults on this album. The fact that there's way too many fucking little filler tracks that connect songs. I mean, just cut that shit out of the album. It would have been a lot better. And there's some weak moments, especially on the second half of the album. And the album kind of ends on a shitty, boring song called Future of Mankind. But this album is chock full of other great songs, especially a song that does everything I liked about the song Loch Ness, but way better. We're talking about the incredibly creepy doom metal song Death.
Messenger of death, wields the scythe of man's damnation.
But it was finally time for Judas Priest to make an album that was going to be a full return to form to their classic sound. But the sad thing is they would do it without one of their founding members, KK Downing. Because KK Downing in the early 2000s died of AIDS. Oh shit, that's Chuck Schuldiner. KK Downing was playing with his band Damage Plan and was shot on stage. Oh shit, wrong guitar. Sorry about that. He was on a bus and the bus. God damn it. Oh, okay, he only left the band. Okay, oh, thank God. There's conflicting stories about why KK Downing left. But I hear a very popular theory that Glenn Tipton keeps wanting a lot of control of the band and it pissed off KK. And I could see that because Glenn always wrote a lot of the songs, played a lot of the guitar solos, and kind of outshined KK way too much. But no need to fear, they got a fantastic young guitarist that breathed life into this band and even co-wrote a lot of songs on the next album. An album that's a perfect summary of all the best things and even some of the worst things about Judas Priest.
Fire in the sky, paralyzing fear. You know you're not inside. Dragon is near.
One of the biggest problems a lot of people cite with this album is that the production is terrible. However, I actually kind of like the production because it gives it this weird old school sound to it. My only problem with it is that it sounds way too fucking loud and compressed. And yeah, it sounds also kind of echoey and weird, but it sounds unique. I've never really heard another album that sounds like this, but I like how the rest of it sounds like an old school 80s album. It's just that it's way too fucking loud, so if they had maybe not compressed it so much, everybody would have loved the production of this album. But that's not really my main problem. My main problem on this album is actually Rob Halford kind of strains a lot of his vocals on some of these songs, especially on songs like Battle Cry, when he tries to do like higher notes. It just sounds really whiny and weird. But the songs on this album are killers. Some of the best material since Painkiller. Start the album with a heavy motherfucker named Dragonaut, Halls of Valhalla. One of the fucking absolute standouts on this album. This song is different and incredible. One of the best Judas Priest songs ever written.
You are calling. You are calling me home.
And hey, Judas Priest get back to actually being able to write hit songs that sound really catchy. We have the fifth song on this album that sounds like old school, catchy. You've got Another Thing Coming style Judas Priest on the song March of the Damned. Then we kind of hit filler territory in the middle of the album. Now, some songs in this middle part of the album I do like. I kind of like Crossfire, Hell and Back. Those two are kind of cool and bluesy. And Down in Flames kind of sounds like typical Judas Priest. But that's the problem, is that the songs before this and even after this point in the album are much more fantastic. And even though some of these songs can be good, it's kind of subpar compared to the rest of these amazing songs. And some of these songs are downright awful. Cold Blooded is boring, and the song Metalizer, even though it has some cool riffs and it tries to be a heavy Painkiller style song, it sounds like a fucking disorganized mess.
He will find you. No spider thrones. Mesmerize you. He is the metalizer.
But then they hit you with some fantastic material at the end of the album. It ends with an incredibly beautiful ballad called The Beginning of the End. And they also have a very dark, brooding, doomy song, Secrets of the Dead, which reminds me a lot of the song Death from the last album. And then my favorite song on the album, the total thrashy speed metal, Painkiller-esque song known as Battle Cry.
Hail the hero coming home. Honor bound from whence he roamed. Fortitude and skill, fortitude and control. Some heads are gonna roll. Some heads are gonna roll. Some heads are gonna roll. Some heads are gonna roll.
So even though these guys are pretty much rocking out in their wheelchairs, except for Richie Faulkner, and Glenn pretty much looks like he doesn't even remember what his name is anymore, the band says they're going to keep soldiering on, I guess, until they fucking die. I guess they never heard the philosophy of, you know, hanging it up while you still got it. But you know what? They kind of still got it. Even though they're making some shitty songs on this album, they do have a lot of crazy, amazing callbacks to their glory days. But man, they gotta hang it up soon, because look at fucking Glenn Tipton. However, the band is working on one more album, and let's hope that they make an album that does not have shitty filler and is heavy as fuck, maybe even a Painkiller 2 style album, before Rob fucking dies or Glenn Tipton forgets who he is again. Alzheimer's, more like old timers.